Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. Tonight, we bring you the third in our four-part conversation series on writing home, writers on writing the places they love. Our guests this evening are Douglas McCullough and Susan Strait, frequent collaborators whose works are firmly rooted in place. I am Katie Porter, and I'm Executive Director of Inlandia Institute, a literary and cultural arts nonprofit based in inland Southern California, the ancestral homelands of the Cahuilla, Gabrielino, Tongva, Luiseno, and Serrano peoples. We respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, Inlandia is home to many indigenous peoples from all over the world, and we express our gratitude to them for allowing us the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. The Humanities Hour series is brought to you in partnership with the Riverside Public Library and sponsored by California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. If you missed the first two installments, you can still check them out on Inlandia's YouTube channel or visit us on Facebook. And now a few housekeeping notes. We do want you to know that closed captioning is available for this event via the CC icon on the lower part of your screen. Also, please note that this is a view-only presentation and it is being recorded. If you have any questions for our speakers, please type them into the Q&A box, and we will have a Q&A period toward the end of the hour. Also, I do want to let you know we have a couple other can't miss events this week. So please stay on till the end, and we will be telling you a little bit more about those and dropping those RSVP links into the chat. And now for our program. It really gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Susan Strait. Susan was born in Riverside, California, where she still lives with her family. From 2010 to 2012, she served as Inlandia's inaugural literary laureate. Her memoir, In the Country of Women, was a national bestseller, and her newest novel, Mecca, will be published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux in March 2022, so coming up right around the corner. Douglas McCullough is an artist, writer, and senior curator at the California Museum of Photography. His work has been shown nationally and internationally in more than 250 exhibitions. He is the author of several books with Inlandia, some of which you might know, including In the Sunshine of Neglect, Facing Fire, and with Susan Strait, More Dreamers of the Golden Dream. So welcome, Susan and Doug.
Hi.
Hey.
It's fun to be doing this, Katie. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, happy to have you.
Well, Doug and I have talked about home a lot over the years, so I think kind of the best way to start, and one of the ways I think, especially for people who are watching this, who might want to be photographers, artists, poets, fiction writers, anything where you're sort of thinking, what does it mean to create what home looks like, right, Doug? Is that if you're taking photographs, for example, Doug and I have done great series about so many places in Riverside County, from sheep herders in Nuevo to rock houses in Redlands. And one of my favorite things is when our work overlaps, and that is I'm obsessed with the Rubidoux drive-in swap meet, because to me, when I go to the swap meet, and I've written about this, I have an essay coming out about the Rubidoux drive-in swap meet. Doug has a great photo of taken in the 1950s of how, it's a beautiful black and white photo of how the swap meet looked back then. I often think about what it means to just sort of celebrate a place like Riverside County, San Bernardino County. What we call Inlandia extends all the way to me, to Corona, to Chino, to, all the way up to Hesperia, all the way out to Coachella. that's what Doug and I have been writing about and taking pictures of. What do you think about our home, Doug? Where would you put the boundaries?
Yeah, boy, it's a hard thing to put boundaries for in the sunshine and neglect. I started out trying to make a map, and the edges of that map ended up being this sort of hazy fog that went partly out the Cajon path. I mean, it's hard to draw a line. You can't really draw a line. What you do is sort of draw this psychic space. This feels like home. And not only that, but I think you and I both have the sort of attitude that it's not just the place, but it's the place animated by people. Right? It's the history, it's the stories, it's the people there.
Right.
There's a great photographer, Frederick Sommer, and he said something like, place itself is not the reality. We are the ones who put life into the stones and the pebbles, you know? So we animate the place. And that's the thing, is really, it's the place with people and stories.
See, and I'm funny because I go the other way. I go like, we're formed by the landscape. I think that we animate the place, but I think that being formed by a place like this, like even today's wind, this is my new book is Mecca, which Katie mentioned, and it's got this great Rodrigo Corral cover, and Doug had sent me some other great pictures of palm trees like lit up. They went with a Joshua tree, but I started out with the Santa Ana wind in this book. I just wrote an essay about Joan Didion that also began with the wind. Look at today's wind and think about how much we're shaped like by wind, by heat, by drought, by fire. Fire is just an integral part of what we grow up with. So I kind of think it works both ways. We're so shaped by what we think of as our native trees, which are really sycamore and cottonwood, and what people come to California and they're like, oh, look at those pepper trees. And I'm like, those are not from here, but they feel like they are because they came in the 1700s, right? So yeah, I like us thinking about landscape.
I know, and it's kind of there are so many imports here. The trees are imports, the plants are imports, the people are imports for the most part, you know? I mean, so that it's pretty great. But the landscape is the landscape we grow up in. Yeah, that is absolutely it, wherever it comes from. And with a geologist as a father, I kind of look at landscape as, hey, the mountains are, you know, they're up, you know, there's Mount Baldy now, but it'll melt away. You know, that's the geologic perspective. Everything is change and flux.
Yeah, I was speaking to about this new book to someone in New York, and I said that I was trying to write about deeply imagined places in a place like Riverside County. I grew up with the Trujillos, and we have written about Agua Mansa before, you and me, and we've written about the Trujillo family's ancestors buried in Agua Mansa Cemetery. And Agua Mansa has been an obsession of Doug's and mine. You leave Riverside and over here is Rubidoux, and you go down the Agua Mansa Road, which is said to be haunted, and I believe it's haunted because people have told me way too many stories about it. And when I think about the Trujillo, Nancy Melendez and Darlene Trujillo coming to one of our shows that we did, Doug, and meeting up with my in-laws and my cousins and realizing that we all went to North together. We all went to that McDonald's on University Avenue. The Trujillo family came here in 1843. The first Trujillos came here in 1843 when this was still rancho land. And of course, they were living on land that had once been Cahuilla land. And to know that I can hang out with, I hung out with Sharon Kasner Trujillo at my North High reunion, like, you know, earlier, I mean, late last fall. And just think, like, she has a tractor that her great-great-great-grandfather had. To think about what that piece of land means for home, and to think how people often say, well, no one is from California. I love saying, well, the Trujillos are from California. And that's what I was obsessed with writing about this time with this book, is that I was thinking about my character, Johnny Frias. I have this fictional character based on my friend Louis Lozano, who wanted to be a CHP officer at one time. And he's from Corona, Louis is. And for 25 years, we've been talking about that. My character is a descendant of the Anza, you know, the Juan Bautista de Anza. The Spaniards crossed, but they brought with them indigenous people from northern Mexico. And those people met and married indigenous Serrano and Cahuilla people in the Chino Hills and San Bernardino Mountains. So I'm thinking about what you said about Mount Baldy. It certainly wasn't called Mount Baldy back then. It had a different name. And yet this is all variations of home, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's interesting because you and I have careened around this landscape in this place, as you said. I mean, from the Coachella Valley, just all over the place. And I think what is kind of wonderful is when I first met you, you said, if I ever get stuck writing, which I don't think you ever do, I look at photographs. And you have all these books of photographs, probably in the stacks behind you there. There's books of photographs. And at the same time, you know, I'm a photo person, but I'm a photo person who loves text and image. I've loved photographers who combine those two, where there's a story and an image. So that's essentially us careening around the landscape. But as a photographer, you essentially are, I mean, not essentially, you absolutely are dealing with light bouncing off of a real thing. I mean, this is this hillside, it's these sheep, you know, that you mentioned, or so on. And so you're basically stenciling off of something real. So it is automatically placed. And then story is kind of an overlay or woven through. I don't know how you see that, but the story is like, is in there. The sheep are in a photo and you can photograph them, but the story of the sheep is something else.
Yeah, I like what you're saying. Even the class I'm teaching right now at UCR is child narrators and YA narrators. And we were doing a book by Elena Maria Viramontes called Under the Feet of Jesus. And we were talking about what it means to work in the fields. And there's a part of that book where there's very, very hard work taking place in a vineyard where the characters are cutting bunches of grapes. And you and I have been in Coachella many times, and we have taken pictures of people working in the fields, and we've gone to talk to people working in the fields, and we've sat there like on the side of the field with them, and people just tell us their whole life story, just like that. Like, why, remember that one guy, Roger, and he was planting tiny watermelon seedlings, Doug?
Absolutely beautiful. Rows,
hundreds of watermelon
rows,
seedlings.
yeah.
And each one he planted had a little tiny cup to protect it from the sun. And he did all the irrigation. Those to me are the deepest evocations of our art, and what we've been able to do is that we actually go out and talk to people, and everyone wants to tell us, if you're a good listener, which we are, everyone wants to tell us what it means to be away from home, like away from Mexico or Guatemala or El Salvador, and what it means to be in California and have California be that home. And then this confluence, like you said, with here's this landscape, very geometrical, and you and I are walking it, talking to people, the stories are circling around, and then you're taking photos. I think it's the best, it's been some of the best times of my life to go on every mile that we could of a large place. Riverside and San Bernardino counties combined are larger than many states, and have a combined population of, at this point, probably close to 6 million people. And I like that we've been documenting it.
You know what? It's an absolute privilege. I regard it as like amazing to have a life where we can just, you know, do that kind of thing. I would add, you say we're good listeners. You are something, having witnessed this untold times at this point, something beyond a good listener. You attract story. If Susan shows up anywhere, somehow there's this alchemy that happens where story just pours out of everyone. I've always
one of my favorites
wasn't bad at it, but you're magic at it. So
one of my favorites is Doug and I were at the Torres Martinez Reservation, and this really showed up in my new book. I just was so grateful. We spent this whole afternoon hanging out at Torres Martinez, and we talked to these two guys, and we were sitting at a picnic table, and the one guy was telling us this great story about how his uncle and his great uncle, they used to get on their horses and leave the Torres Martinez reservation, and they'd want to go party at Agua Caliente long before casinos or anything else. And he's like, yeah, they would get on their horses and they would ride straight across till they hit the mountain, and then they would turn right. Remember, Doug?
Yeah,
then they would ride all along the mountain till they got to the party, the fiesta. And then they would stay at the fiesta, spend the night, do a lot of drinking. In the morning, they would get on their horse and they would ride, and then they would turn left.
right. Cross the Whitewater River and everything else. I know. I have a whole lot. They were telling these stories, and I'm kind of circling around that picnic table under those tall palms, beautiful, and shooting photos. I mean, I probably have 100 photos of those guys talking and telling stories and gesturing. So great.
So I think that's what I wanted to say to people who are watching this, who are thinking, well, how do you write about home? I think that I've always been pushing against this notion that, for example, last night, my youngest daughter, Rosette, and we were watching The Gilded Age. She was home for the evening to help, her dad has been sick. And my daughter works on the show Below Deck, which is funny. Talk about like a rootless kind of show. Everybody's on a boat. But we were watching The Gilded Age, where, you know, the history of New York and how there's the old and the new. And according to everyone, there is nothing old in California. And I just sit here and think, we were at the Torres Martinez Reservation, which has been in that particular land. Coachella comes from the word conchia, which is the tiny little clams and conch shells that were at the outside of Lake Cahuilla, which you can see in the outcroppings of stone. That's time immemorial. And you and I have also been on the Morongo Reservation and gone to the funeral for Catherine Siva Sobel, whose ancestors were in Morongo. So I often think that what I've been doing and what you might be doing in the audience is, if you're writing about home and you're writing about your landscape, no matter where you're from, is to think about that kind of thing. Like, what are the stories that grandparents tell? And what are the stories that the great aunts tell? And why it's good for us to sit and listen. When this book came out, the memoir In the Country of Women, which Doug contributed all the photos to that book, people wrote to me from all over the country and said, I read your memoir and I'm finally realizing I have to listen to my grandparents, like at Thanksgiving, rather than just be annoyed and want to get away from the table. You have to listen to know what home meant to that generation and the generation before, and then to figure out what our ideas of home mean. What do you think about that, Doug?
You know, I have a question for you directly related to this. You're talking about essentially listening in a really intent way and collecting the stories and honoring these people and then transforming it into art, which is what you do. These books, I mean, they're award-winning. You're fantastic. How much do you see yourself as a creator versus a conduit? You know, how much are you passing these stories through and how much are you creating? Like, what's the ratio there? I mean, I've never asked you this, but it seems.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think you do the same for photography. Like, we're both at a place. Here you are looking at a scene, but you're framing the scene in a very specific way. I think if someone tells me that story, like the story of their uncle riding his horse across the desert and then turning right, I often think about, I often think about, like, how do you make that into a fictional character that somebody cares about, right? So if you're writing memoir, yes, that memoir was really very difficult to write because you're trying to stick to the truth. And for those of you who are writing memoir, it's one of the most difficult forms. I remember Carolyn Z wrote a great memoir called Dreaming, which was about being the child of alcoholics and also struggling with alcoholism in California. And she said when she finished the memoir, the next day she woke up and she had meningitis. It was the worst thing ever. She said writing the memoir almost killed her, literally. And fiction never felt that way. So, Doug, I think for fiction, the joy of it is to wander around for me and think about, like, what do the trees look like in the scene? And, like, what does it sound like? And then to have a character in mind that's not exactly like something that someone's told me.
Right.
But to have that scene in mind where someone rides across the desert, and then what do the mountains look like when they turn right? And then who's the woman there that person is waiting to meet at the fiesta? So it is it's a combination, which is the same thing you do in your photographs.
No, absolutely. I mean, photography, you're stuck with what's in front of you. You can stage something for the camera, which people certainly do. There's a whole genre of that, but that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in absolutely, doing what kind of the Dadaists and Surrealists did, which is be in front of something real, but then try and sort of scratch through the surface of it and get at something more real underneath, surreal. I mean, that's where surrealism comes from, is that in the everyday, if you approach it right and kind of honor it and scratch through that surface, there's something beyond real underneath it that's even richer. I mean, that's art. That's what you're aiming for.
Well, I love this. Let's share some of those photos that you that you had assembled.
All right, and you should read some from Mecca too. So
I will, but let's look at some of these photos from More Dreamers, because that's our book that we worked on with Inlandia, and that this is such a beautiful. This photo is what started our whole project way back in 2011, and this photo in real life is a very small fragment. It's about the size that I'm holding up here, and it's a fragment. It's a triangular fragment of a photo that was that I found right here in the office. I was going through this big crate. My sister-in-law, Christine Sim-Stuckey, had me rescue because there was a roof leak in the back of the house where she was living. And she had this big crate of, and inside was photos and broken glass and Christmas ornaments and Halloween candy. You know how our lives are. And I pulled out this baggie, and here was this fragment of a photo, and Douglas was able to restore it, you know, digitally restore it so that it's beautiful. And so this is my mother-in-law on the far right, Alberta Sims. And this is her sister, Rosie Morris, who just died 3 years ago. And we know that there's somebody wearing white gloves in the background, and it's a formal affair. So we think they might be at March Air Force Base at like a formal NAACP dance, possibly, or an elite dance. But this is a mysterious photo, and it led to us, to Doug and me, wanting to think more about preserving the history of Riverside's East Side. So, yeah.
I have to say, I mean, it is this tiny little fragment of a photo, but out of all More Dreamers, this is still my favorite photo. I mean, I shot a bunch of photos. There's all kinds of wonderful photos, but this one, and in the exhibition that just closed at Riverside Art Museum, it's 5 feet wide. I mean, it's really a big thing. It's just beautiful. And then place.
Right. Talk about home. This is Daisy Carter's house, which is on the corner of 11th and Kansas, in the heart of Riverside's East Side community. And this house burned in 2011. And my husband, Dwayne, and my brother-in-law, Trent Chatham, both called to tell me about it. And the next morning, very next morning, while it was really still steaming, I called Doug and said, would you take pictures? Because this was an iconic house. Alberta and Rosie, who you just saw, they grew up in this house as girls. There were 4 beautiful sisters who lived in this house. And the door that's facing us, right by that palm tree, that is sort of the side door. And there used to be 2 little benches that were sitting there. And those girls would sit on benches facing each other. And people still told us that story, didn't they, Doug? Years and years later, they'd say, oh, I was in love with this one of the beautiful sisters.
You could hardly run across, you know, I mean, a male of a certain age in that whole neighborhood there. They would all remember these amazing sisters. I still drive by, you know, every couple of weeks. I go, oh, you probably do too. And the house is now scraped down. It's just a lot. There is a photo coming up further on.
This is Daisy Carter in the flowered dress on the far right for me. And she is the mother of the 4 beautiful daughters, Alberta, Mary, Myrtle, and Rosie. And she's wearing this amazing hat. And they are inside that house that Doug took pictures of. And this is a historic photo that my family has had forever. And the woman on the other side is Hattie Davis, who then became Hattie Moss and is still alive here in Riverside in her 90s, a legendary figure. And the woman in the middle is called Sweet Annie, or Aunt Dear. And she accompanied her niece, Daisy Carter, from Mississippi through Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and into Calexico, California. And Daisy brought these 4 daughters with her, and they became an iconic family on Riverside's East Side. But this is the kind of photo that Doug and I love. When you talk about home, look at this beautiful home that Daisy made for herself after having been orphaned at the age of 5 and never having had her own home. She owned that house on the corner of 11th and Kansas. And it meant that that was an iconic place in the community.
And I love the photo in the sense that, you know, I you know, just scan these things, but try to scan them that retain all the sort of damage and the crinkles and the scratches that they've carried forward. I mean, we've all, the people have all traveled a long journey. The photos have all traveled a long journey. There's this other one. And I love this one as well. Just so great.
this is the outside of Daisy Carter's house, the house we were just looking at. And this is my mother-in-law, Alberta, looking shyly down. And when you see how young she is, she's only 18. She's graduated from Riverside Poly High School the day before, and she's getting ready to get married to General Roscoe Conklin Sims, who's just a couple years older than her. And next to her is Loretta Preston Sims, and that is her sister-in-law. And Loretta's only 14 at the time, and Alberta's 18. And just think about them. They're headed out into the world, and they're in front of Daisy Carter's house. So it's just, again, it's still a question of home, you know, and like Alberta's setting out to be a young married woman, and she only moved a block away. And then yet that was a big deal. That was a big deal.
So the book, More Dreamers of the Golden Dream, has 10 stories that are all these interlinked stories that Susan's marvelous writing is, and the photos. So here's the spot where Daisy Carter's house was. And you can explain what was going on here, Susan.
Well, I think what happened was all the people that know Doug so well now in my family that have known him since 2011, this was it was like 9 months later, and they called and said, oh, they're getting ready to bulldoze the house, what's left of the house, that Daisy Carter's house that burned. And so Doug came and took pictures he had taken pictures of the house. He took pictures of the descendants of Daisy walking across that land that had once been hers. And so there's my ex-husband carrying the water bottle, Dwayne Sims, his cousin, Eddie Chandler III, General Sims III, Carnell Sims, and Sensei Sims, who is General's son. So you really have, you know, the next two generations. And now Sensei also has a son. So you have the whole next generation. So when you think about how many humans Daisy Carter was responsible for, that's what I ended up writing in the memoir, is sometimes I would add up how many humans that one woman, Daisy Carter, was responsible for bringing into the world. And we ended up at that time, Doug, it was like 128. And it's more now because that was a while.
Yeah. This was a strange and wistful moment because everybody was remembering the house. It was almost like the house still existed there in their minds. I remember Dwayne he went a little bit further and he stopped, and you'll remember, picked up a doorknob that had somehow a door stop, yeah, that had somehow escaped and picked it out, went, hey, look, yeah, I know, pretty amazing.
Yeah. This is the driveway on Michael Street. So this is Doug's and my second favorite photo, I believe. And Michael Street on Riverside's east side, this is exactly around the corner from Daisy Carter's house. So when General and Alberta were married, eventually they bought this house, and it's still in the family. And this is where we've gathered for all these years. The first time I walked up the driveway to this house, I was 15 years old, and I met my future in-laws for the first time. And so what I like about this photo is that it's everything we're talking about today. We're talking about home and like what we as writers, as humans, as artists, but also as just residents of the world, what do we value about home? And this is the kind of place that someone would drive by and think, oh, what is that place? That's not very impressive. And yet it's the locus of Daisy Carter's descendants. This is the home of General and Alberta. And my little mom, who was born in Switzerland, when everyone came to our house after my father passed away just this past May, my mom says, I used to drive by Michael Street, the driveway on Michael Street, twice a week on my way home from work, because I always knew someone would be there, and it gave me a warm feeling. And I just thought that was so funny that my little Swiss mom idolized this driveway because she says it was such a place of gathering and warmth. So this
I
photo
have to say, it's absolutely, it is absolutely that. I mean, the only thing I ever hear from people associated with this is, why don't you come by more often? Like, where are you? You know, come on by, you know, or the male person will go by and they'll be like, here, stop here, have some food. I mean, it's really amazingly hospitable. So I think close to 8 years after this photo was taken, Susan, you and I went back again, you know, I mean, we've been there repeatedly, but went back again. And leaving your house, you grabbed this photo, framed photo of that photo, and then it kept getting passed around because everybody was trying to figure out, wait, who is this? Like, and making fun of each other for like, you know.
You used to be a lot bigger, they kept saying. So Keith, that's who I'm talking to in the photo, Keith is saying like, I used to be too big. Look at me in that hoodie. Look, I look so much better now. And so this is, you know, our all of like my nephews, family, friends, 2 of my brothers-in-law, and my brother-in-law General is holding this photo. He's the person reflected in it, and we both had just been sitting on his car. And then I got up because Keith called me, so I went over there, and Keith is telling me a story. And yeah, 8 years have passed, and it's as if it was yesterday. And I like the way that Doug, that you framed this because it's so timeless. Nobody was really looking at you. Everyone was actually deep in conversation with each other. And you can't, the one thing I was really looking forward to saying to you today is, again, for those people who are listening who want to be writers, you have to use your imagination, and you have to use the natural setting if you're going to be like a photographer, because Doug makes himself invisible, and that way everyone's animated and they're not looking posed, are they, Doug?
No, I know. The great French photographer, Robert Doisneau, said every photographer wants to be invisible. So you try and, I'm like almost 6'2", but I try and just eventually fade away and just be there, you know, so that everything's carrying on. I don't want to stir. Yeah, it's pretty great. Another photo in the driveway. Yeah,
this was a different day than the first one. And this was more in the daytime. And you can see that everybody, no, this was the same day, but it was earlier in the day. Was that it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was earlier in the day.
Earlier in the day. But you can just see my brother-in-law Montrell is sitting on the side laughing. You know, that's what is so strange. Like Montrell just had COVID. He's okay. Trent had COVID. General had COVID. It's just thinking about, you know, how this year has made everything seem so scary and tenuous. Seeing this photo, my brother-in-law Derek is looking straight at us, and with just this grin on his face. And so Derek is the memory of all the people in this photo. Derek remembers everyone's birthdays, where they lived, everything about them. He's the encyclopedia, and I'm just
more than you. More than you.
Way more than me. Every time someone says, well, what about this? They say, call Derek. And so I do love that you immortalize this moment.
All right. I think you should read. We're going to run out of time.
It would be fun to sort of say to you that I enjoyed writing this memoir, which also contains a lot of these stories, and was sort of a beginning for Doug and I then to work on more Dreamers within Landia. And so it's funny, I'm drinking my tea because I taught earlier today. LA Times Festival of Books, Landia is going to have a booth there for the first time, I think, and that's exciting. So I'm thinking now, because it's February, this book comes out in March. And so now suddenly I was thinking, I'm going to be at the LA Times Book Festival, and I'm going to be talking about much of what we're talking about now. So I was really grateful that Landia asked me to talk about this. And for those of you, again, who want to be writers, Doug and I love to look at like how something is put together. So I just want to show you the design of a book is really something. This is look at that frontispiece, Doug. Isn't that nice? Like there's nopales. And it's funny because someone said to me like, wait, what are those? And I said, nopales. And they're like, what kind of cactus is that? And I'm like, nopales. When you grow up here, you don't ever call it anything else. So I was like, I don't know what it's called in English. So I had to look it up. It's the Opuntia cactus. And you just never call it that. I'm going to read you a tiny little bit from part 1, which is exactly what I was saying to you. Is I was thinking about how the Santa Ana winds feel for us here in a place like this, coming down the Cajon Pass, coming down the Santa Ana River. And I was thinking, Doug, about how people from other places think about the iconic Santa Ana winds, and like, you know, Didion's famous and Chandler's famous, like meek housewives test their carving knives. So this is Johnny Frias, the guy I described to you, and he is a California highway patrolman on a motorcycle, and he is on shift. He's driving the 91. Maybe anybody listening to this, actually, I won't have to explain what the 91 is, but he's going along the Santa Ana River between Yorba Linda and Corona. The wind started up at 3 a.m., the way it had for hundreds of years, the same way I used to hear the blowing so hard around our little house in the canyon that the loose windowsills sounded like harmonicas. The old metal weather stripping played like the gods pressed their mouths around the screens in the living room where I slept when I was growing up. After I got off work this morning, the wind took a break and I was knocked out for a few hours, waking up in my triplex to hear Rose Sotelo's radio next door playing ranchera music, tubas and trumpets thumping against the stucco, her canaries worried in their little songs. But now that I was back on shift, my CHP Harley was pushing hard against the biggest gusts. The Santa Anas were blowing crazier than ever, the way they did in the afternoons. Fierce from the nap. Brazilian pepper trees, the ones that grew in every vacant lot or frontage road area along the 91 and the 55 freeways, had those long branches like ferns or seaweed. And when the wind blew them sideways, like skirts, I could see homeless encampments under a lot of the trees. But fall winds always made me think of my mother, holding me tight in the old redwood chair my father had tied to the porch railing up in Fuego Canyon, while the Santa Anas blew in the black night when they always started. My first memory of my mother, her talking to me before dawn, the gusts so strong it felt like our house would go rolling down the canyon like a tumbleweed, the horses snorting in the barn, and my father down in the orange groves, making sure the trees didn't dry out. Nothing else is for sure but the wind, she would say, while the eucalyptus leaves and bark flew past us. We might not get rain, mijo, for a whole year, but we always get the Santanas. My mother loved the wind, but she knew the flames would follow. And it wasn't just that she was watching for fire. She would hold me tight and say, we're gonna look out for smoke, but right now, look at this, Johnny. Mira, it's like we're in the ocean. Everything was moving except for us.
That is beautiful. So, you know, listening to that passage, it's so descriptive. It is almost photographic. You're writing that? Are you visualizing it? Like, do you see it in your mind?
I think that you have to, what I always tell writers, and I always tell my students, you have to spend a long time walking around being inside your character. Like, you have to walk around thinking, I'm this person, or I'm an 85-year-old woman, or I'm a 5-year-old boy, or whatever, because that's how you see the pepper tree. Like, some person sees the pepper tree, and for me, when I was little, you walked up to the pepper tree and you opened the branches like a curtain, almost like the beaded curtain of France. You open the branches and your friends are there waiting for you, right? And maybe they have some cigarettes or something you're not supposed to have, but you're hiding in the pepper tree. But a little boy might walk by the pepper tree and see the big hole where like a raccoon lives. And an 85-year-old woman might walk by the pepper tree and see the actual pepper berries themselves and remember something completely different. So it's always about being inside the character and how that character feels about the canyon or the wind. That's how I think about it. What about you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's partly engaging with people when you're photographing them, is you try and sort of get inside their space. It's what you're talking about, is honor who they are and how I become almost insanely agreeable. People can say almost anything. Oh, I think the most outlandish thing and I'll just say, oh yeah, I think so, because I don't I don't want to contradict them. That's not my place. My place is to be there and actually be really, really present and honor how they're seeing this place. And that's, you're talking about channeling multiple people in that way, whether it's the kid or the 85-year-old or whatever.
But think about it this way. I think the best thing to bring up, two of my favorite recent shows besides Our More Dreamers, In the Sunshine of Neglect was quite amazing, because here's a portrait of the Inland Empire. Everything from the way swimming pools looked, to the way the drive-in looks, to the way the mountains look in Moreno Valley, to all of these. Like, if someone wants to look at that book, that's a true evocation of home. And then my other one that I love is Facing Fire. I really love the show Facing Fire because people also make fun of us for being vulnerable to fire. But you captured in that assembling that show, the beauty, the terror, all of it together in the fire. So what do you think about that?
You know, I got really quite obsessed with that fire show just because we live in this place, and I've watched fires, my whole life. And now, of course, they're getting more and more extreme in California, and everybody on the East Coast goes, "Oh my God, my father was always, yeah, this is a natural thing. This is what happens around here. And if you suppress fire for 100 years, they get a little worse." But, his point of view as a geologist was always like, "Oh, great. It burned off all the chaparral. So now I can find the rocks. This is great." So I don't know. For everybody, this is a show that was at the California Museum of Photography and is now going to travel to like 4 other places all over the West. That talks about fire in the West, and specifically fire in California. A lot of the top photographers, but other artists responding to fire. Fire is fascinating. It's also metaphoric. It's central to humanity. I mean, I don't want to go off on a riffing too much on fire, but it is very much about a place. I mean, I'm just kind of waiting for Idlewild and Big Bear and Lake Arrowhead to totally burn down. And if you talk to a fire specialist, they're like, it's only a matter of time until Idlewild is dust,
Yeah. One of the most iconic photos in that show to me was a famous one where some guys are playing basketball and literally the hills are on fire behind them. Yeah. They're like in their yard, like playing basketball. And then other people are standing there, of course, with garden hoses, but also there are the kids that always gather at the edge of a fire in California. And that's who we were when my brothers and me were little, is that we were the kids that would ride straight down to the river bottom or straight up to the Box Springs Mountains just to see the fire, because fire was a part of our home. Like, we were used to fire. It was expected that we were going to see fire. And there were fewer of us back then. It's true. But I just think about like the way right now there's a blizzard in the East Coast. And so the beautiful legendary of, the snow shovel, like, right? We don't have the snow shovel. We have the Pulaski. That's the tool that you use to dig a fire break. That's what I guess I wanted to say, because I'm sure we're getting close to being doing Q&A, is that when you're trying to write about home or think about home or photograph home or create songs about home, again, you're thinking like, that's the shovel. The snow shovel looks like this. The Pulaski looks like this. Like, fire is our natural medium. I'm not saying that I like it. It's terrifying, but it has been here forever in the way that blizzards are forever. The wind is forever. I like thinking about those things when we're thinking, how do you write about home? How do you document home in a photograph? And what I think Doug and I have always tried to do is, yes, A, be good listeners, but B, accept all of it. Fire is a danger and fire is beautiful, but fire is also native to this place. Long before people got here, there was already fire, right?
I love that you pick out that's a Kevin Cooley photo, the one you mentioned where they're shooting baskets, and it's in Altadena, and the entire like mountainside right behind them is completely on fire, and they're like, oh, swish, good shot. It's fantastic. There's another one by Kevin Cooley that was hung in the show close to that, in which a kid is kind of like leaning against a fence and slumped down and playing a video game while it's at night, and the entire background is this insane glow, and he's like absorbed in his phone. It's beautiful.
Which
people
me,
just carry on,
Yeah, and today people are sending me photos from Canada, and they're out walking in their snowshoes, and it's no big deal. And you and I would be like, oh my God, no, it's so cold, right? And yet that, like, to be in a blizzard, to be caught in a blizzard, to be cold is the opposite of playing a video game, in front of the fire. Those are just both amazing evocations of home. Anyway.
Yeah, another place, another home. If people have questions, throw them in the. Otherwise, we'll just carry on in our normal fashion.
I will say that again. One other thing about writing home is to think about the dialogue. The last thing I kind of wanted to add as a craft thing is to think about how people talk. I love that Inlandia is doing workshops, memoir, poetry, things like that. I think dialogue is the other key, Doug. When you're writing fiction or memoir or poetry, or if you're doing screenwriting and you're trying to really capture a home, like a landscape, it's all about how people talk, isn't it? Like the way someone talks in New York, someone from the Bronx speaks completely different, for example, possibly than someone from Manhattan. And here, like for example, Spanish, you know, if you're looking at Tejano Spanish versus New York Spanish, like even the Inland Empire has its own Spanish, right? There are even words that people would say in Southern California that they wouldn't say anywhere else. And I love my colleague, Alex Espinoza, and I talk about this all the time, is that when he first entered my class at UCR, I asked who in the room knows what a ranfla is. And Alex was just so surprised because he was from San Bernardino. A ranfla is the equivalent of a hoopty, which is a specific kind of car, right? So Trent,
I know.
Right, in the driveway that you saw on Michael Street, everyone would say, you know, when I was younger, they'd be like, yo man, like check out his hoopty. Like he's got the tennis shoes, and that's a specific kind of tire. It's a very, it fits on a very specific kind of car. And it's not a giant, you know, four-wheeler kind of tire. So Alex laughed because he's the only one that knew what a ranfla was. And this is our legend when we talk about home. Like think about the way that people talk in San Bernardino and Riverside, and think about the way people talk in LA. And that's a completely different way that someone talks when they're in Colorado. So my real father, who was from Colorado, ended up living in Ontario and Claremont for the rest of his life after he was 15. And he would take me up to Lido Creek and he'd say, we're going to the creek. He literally never said creek in his life. He said, we're going to the creek and we're going to catch some fish. And then, but before that, I have to have a cup of Joe. And I'd be like, what is this man talking about? Because my stepdad was from Canada and he would never say creek. And he would also never say cup of Joe. And so I just love the way all of the regional languages work in America. So those of you who are writing fiction or memoir or poetry or doing screenwriting, think about how people talk too. Think about the dialogue, how that works.
This is well outside my area of expertise, this whole thing. I mean, I'm aware of this, but you have an insane sensitivity to it. But I do remember an article probably 20 years ago in the New Yorker, I have no idea who the author was, about a linguist who specialized in mapping where people were from. And it wasn't just this person is from Brooklyn or from, you know, a South Central Los Angeles, but they could pin down a neighborhood by specific language and how things were pronounced and so on. And it had this vast collection of recordings made, and they had mapped certain usages almost block by block. I mean, it's crazy, but I think we're talking about place and home and landscape and so on. So there's this overlay of language that's also as distinctive as Mount Baldy or whatever, you know.
Absolutely.
It's pretty marvelous. Yeah.
I know that when I was working on Mecca, I have a character, so Johnny Frias is the main character, and you know, he grows up on this rancho, this cattle ranch in Chino Hills, and that's what I wanted to sort of document, like what happens when you have an isolated place like that. So I mean, his grandparents clearly spoke Spanish, and also the woman who owns the ranch is Mrs. Anza. She is one of the Anza people, and she is 90. So she speaks Spanish as well. And yet she represents a certain kind of California Spanish, right? But when Johnny goes to school, he goes to kindergarten in Santa Ana. Well, that's a whole nother kind of Spanish. And then when he becomes a CHP officer, his first training officer is Milt Olson, who is a Dust Bowl guy from Oklahoma. So I had such a good time writing just what you said, like, you know, Melt Olson would say something like, he's busy getting pie-eyed every night. And poor Johnny Frias is like, you know, he's 20 and he's like, what the heck is pie-eyed? And like, I just was thinking of my dad and all those Dust Bowl guys I knew and the way they used to talk, you know. He was up at the crick, you know, getting pie-eyed. What does that mean? He was getting drunk, but it's like, what the heck? What is pie-eyed? So I have to say, I had such a good time sort of writing about the American language, not the English language, but the American language. So to think about when someone's like, you know, Mano, like go get the ramfla. Like what is that but California? What is that but our home language?
I know, the richness of it. That's the thing that I think you and I both love and celebrate, is the complexity. I love the fact that you can go get almost any kind of food. You can, it's the variety and richness. And I would hate to live in a place where it's kind of monotone. I mean, California is just a great place. Yeah. In the US, the mixture and the richness of it all.
I think we're lucky. I do. Whenever anyone says to me like, but what about this and what about that? And I always think, but that never outweighs my joy in seeing, the Box Springs Mountain turn green and thinking about what it means to come down the Cajon Pass and the history of a place like the Cajon Pass, and to be out in Coachella, which, as you know, one of the most beautiful places in the world is the Coachella Valley. Absolutely the most beautiful.
Yeah, and kind of otherworldly. I mean, it really is amazing to have, the Salton Sea below sea level, and then the geometry of all the fields and the mountains on both sides, and the late light versus the midday light. It's such a rich and wonderful place.
And look what's funny, we haven't brought up the beach a single time. Which everyone says, don't you wish you lived at the beach? And I'm always like, no.
I had an early project called Chance Encounters, going to quarter-mile random squares all over Los Angeles, urban Los Angeles County. And people always like, where are all the photos of the beach? I'm like, you know what? If you do things by chance and draw it literally out of containers and go, okay, I'm going to this quarter mile. It took me a few years to even get a chunk of beach. I mean, like the idea that beach is it in Southern California is completely wrong. It's also wrong that it's palm trees and Rodeo Drive. I mean, I never got that, And so if you really kind of try and represent it, which is what this sort of chance operation thing is, it's almost like sampling Southern California. Oh man, beach is a tiny fraction of what exists around here.
And the big giant, like iconic tall palms, which I have in front of my house, the very tall ones, are not the natives. The natives are the Washingtonia filifera. And the funny thing is, Delphine, my middle kid, she was home and we were walking down by the Santa Ana River. And she was just like, it's just so weird to see some of the palms with their giant skirts all the way to the ground. And I'm like, if you think about it, that's the native palm and it's not trimmed. Why would it be trimmed? Because it's wild. That's the ecosystem for hundreds of animals. Like think about what lives there, birds, rats, mice. Like there are so many insects. Everything is in that skirt of palms. And that's our native palm. And then the palm that's very nice and clean, that, is the one that they always show in Beverly Hills, the tall, skinny one. I really dearly love those, especially in the wind. But that's not the only kind of palm we have. Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the great places, if people have been, is Tahquitz Canyon, above Palm Springs, where it's like a cathedral of the native palms and all thatch, just so beautiful. I mean, it's just amazing. And you come out of the harsh sun into this shaded, beautiful, it's like being in a cathedral. It's just fantastic. It is.
There's nothing like it.
Yeah, really.
Well, I don't know that we have any questions, Katie or Janine, do we?
I think everybody's just mesmerized. And, I've just been sitting here struck by, the fact, I think we take where we are for granted, that we don't really take the time to look at our surroundings, because we live there and we're just traveling through our days and we're always looking, outward. I think it takes a special kind of attention to look around and see and really appreciate those things like the palm trees. And I've, often noticed the ones that have those big long skirts and then saw the other ones that are, don't have one. And I didn't know that there were different, that there was one that was native and one that wasn't. And anyhow,
I love it because the story I'm working on now, I'm working on a short story right now, and it's called The Skinners. And it's about guys who are palm tree skinners. So it's not just you're trimming the tree, but like people get so obsessive that they want all the bark trimmed off the tree. So I have a crew The Reyes family is 3 generations of palm tree skinners, and they're from Rialto. That's my news story. So when I send it to New York, they're going to be like, what is Rialto? And I'll be like, don't you wish you knew? Sorry, I see we have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. What hints do you have for us writers to bring writing about the IE as a character?
Well, I think Juanita has an event coming up with Inlandia soon, which I'm going to be telling my students about. True, Katie?
Well, you know, we just had one with her, but she's going to be a guest at UCR Writers Week.
Yes,
so
that's what it was. I knew I just had seen your name, Juanita, somewhere. Hints about writing about the IE itself as a character, to me, are just kind of what we've been talking about. Like, think about how people make fun of the freeways. You know, that Saturday Night Live ongoing skit where people are like, oh, they're all blonde and they're all in Malibu, and they're like, you take the 405. Well, for me and for many of us, like, my neighbors have to drive on the freeway. Like, my neighbor Mario, right now, while we're sitting here, I can see Mario, he's packing up his truck. And it's nighttime. His truck is parked on the grass right next door. I can see it out my window because he does heating and air conditioning. He's literally packing up his truck. And we have this ongoing thing where no matter where I've driven, Mario has driven 4 times as much. He'll be going to collect the co, or he'll be driving to Santa Clarita. Sometimes he drives to Fresno and comes back. And so, like, to think about, Juanita, like, what does it mean to love freeways? Because not because you have to, I mean, not because you want to, but because you have to. Or, like, I love how everybody talks about our food, right? I loved David Allen's recent piece about Super Burrito in San Bernardino. That was a great piece where the guy that runs Super Burrito was finally retiring. And he said, like, one time something happened and these cops came up, they're like, no, man, that's the guy that owns Super Burrito. Like, that's a great story. So I would say, Juanita, like, what I think what we have to use is even the word super burrito. It's just, how can you get better than that, right? And we use the palm trees, we use the freeways. Doug, what would you say?
Absolutely. I think what part of what drove In the Sunshine of Neglect, the exhibition and book about photographers engaged with inland Southern California, is the fact that there's a freedom here. It's sort of on the periphery. It's an edge. It's not Los Angeles where everybody's following the same line and trying to compete with each other. Instead, there's a freedom to experiment here and a freedom to actually engage with what is here, which is what you're saying. Hey, if Super Burrito is here, let's do Super Burrito. And, you know, it's the same thing. Scratch through the surface of that and honor that. Yeah.
And I think, like, I like Juanita's question a lot because I'm teaching students at UCR right now in my class with child narrator, YA narrator, and my students are from all over. They're from Fresno and Santa Barbara and up north, you know, in NorCal. But the interesting thing is we're going to have Keenan Norris talk to us at the end of the class. We're using Keenan Norris's book, Brother and the Dancer, because we used Helena Maria Viramontes' book, but I want them to see, what does it mean to write about San Bernardino? You know, what does it mean to be from a place like Highland and to write about a landscape like San Bernardino? So Keenan's going to talk to us about that. So I love this idea that we, Juanita, me, Doug, Keenan, Alex, we're all writing about this place. I'm really proud of it. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. My last comment about that is there's like, it's open field running, you know, to use a football metaphor, because there would be shelves and shelves and shelves of book about San Francisco. Why write another book about San Francisco? But here, man, there's like, it's wide open. Go for it.
Yep. And we got this because there's no place like the IE. So we're fine, right?
That's very true. And, you know, that's a really good segue because we have Keenan this Sunday. We're talking to Keenan on Zoom about his book, The Confession of Copeland Kane. So I hope folks in the audience will RSVP for that. We'll be dropping the link into the chat. And we've got some other, you know, really great events with people who are from here, writing about here. But I really want to say thank you to both of you, Susan and Doug. I think Juanita put in the chat that you're her idol. I think you are for so many of us, and both of you in so many different ways.
Susan, it's an honor. Yeah.
Well, I certainly don't feel like that most of the time. I feel like I gotta like do this and do that and cook all this and do all the laundry. But even though we're at 7, I do want to say with the money from Cal Humanities for this program tonight, I'm gonna buy 20 copies of our More Dreamers book that Doug held up and showed. And those are going to be donated to all of our local libraries, because this is a Riverside Public Library Cal Humanities project. So I'm thinking if people in the audience would please put in the chat what library they'd like us to donate the book to, that would be good. Because I'm thinking Glen Avon Library needs a book, Mecca Library needs a book, Marina Valley probably needs a book. And yeah, Katie, so you and Janine and I will work on that. We'll get 20 books out to libraries. Ontario, cool. So put in the chat if you'd like. Oh yes, Arlanza, that'd be great. Put in the chat which library you'd like us to get a book to, and we'll work on that, okay?
Super grateful. And so thank you, Susan. That is very generous, and so excited to get those into libraries. And with that, I want to say thank you to the Riverside Public Library. Thank you to California Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities, because this funding was part of the American Rescue Plan Act. And also please join us tomorrow night for Romaine Washington, James Coates, George Hammonds, and Lydia Thionware-I talking about the language of healing and the poetry of hope. And then of course on Sunday, we've got Keenan Norris and the Confession of Copeland Kane. And then on February 16th, our last Humanities Hour presentation will feature Isabel Quintero and Cassandra Lopez. So same time.
Oh, great writers.
Yeah. I'm really excited. This has been a wonderful series.
Very good series. I've given away so many copies of Isabel Quintero's book, thanks to you, from the Fence Library. It always gets snatched up real quick. All right, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
All right. See you.
All right, bye.
Bye.